So it's kind of late and I've been outside painting all day. So I'll try to keep this a shorter episode, but I have a couple pretty important concepts that I want to talk about. And they actually relate to the previous episode, which was about intelligence and networking of minds. And I'm not going to go into the dirty details of that. You'll have to listen to that prior episode to get a lot of the gist and to really understand as I build the topics. But there's some overlap with this episode with intelligence. And essentially, to summarize what intelligence is your capacity to think in the abstract. So things that aren't really in front of you. So this helps with things like long-term planning. Somebody who can't think in the abstract is going to, if they're given a bunch of money or stumble upon a bunch of resources or a pile of food, they're going to eat it all right away or spend it all right away. Also, intelligence is the ability to effectively use metacognition, and that means to think about how you're thinking, to consciously monitor your own thoughts and why you're thinking those thoughts. And the reason why I brought this up in the previous episode, it was related to a book called The Bell Curve, which is written by a guy named Charles Murray. Once again, I'm not going to get into that particular book, but you should know that I talk about in the previous episode how intelligence is going to be extremely important moving forward. And I actually believe that it's going to be one of two primary dividing lines among humanity moving forward. So in the 20th century, there were a couple dividing lines, and those were nationality, race, and class. And all three of those manifested themselves in three pretty horrific mass movements. For class, it was communism. For nationality, it was fascism. And for race, it was Nazism. And I think the new dividing line, like I said before, is going to be intelligence. And you're going to see that play out with, first of all, jobs. As the cognitive requirements for jobs tick up, that means a lot of people are going to be locked out of the workforce. So there are a lot of implications to intelligence. And I think that one of the key factors that we need to keep in mind is wherever you fall on the spectrum of intelligence, and I mentioned in the previous episode, intelligence and knowledge, not the same thing. Knowledge is like the books on your mental bookshelf, where intelligence is your capacity to flip between the books and recall them at random and have numerous books open at once. And so it's going to be important because the concept of intelligence has implications on how we run society and some major institutions like education. So it's a central liberal tenet that you can effectively educate the population and bring everybody up to a point where they can be a full participant in our representative democracy. But you actually can't educate intelligence into somebody. You can cram information into their heads, but that's just rote memorization, that's recall. So the implication is that how do you effectively have responsible elections for a vast range of intelligence if a lot of people effectively don't understand the issues and what is being voted on, even if we have news that can theoretically inform people. The other thing is something like juries. How can you have a jury of your peers if we're taking a cross-section of the population and that's representative of different levels of intelligence? How are they possibly going to understand the nuances of the evidence that's put before them? That's why a lot of people, I think, go for the showmanship, and why you have lawyers sort of putting on a performance, and that tends to be what sways a lot of juries. So there are a lot of implications to this, and they can be uncomfortable. But the thing that we have to remember is that everybody has humanity, and whatever somebody's intelligence happens to be is no fault of their own. And I think it's really important that we remember that as people lose economic value, they still have human value. And it's incumbent upon people who are at the higher end of that intelligence spectrum to uh, figure out ways in which to include everybody in society. And we have deceived ourselves in the past in thinking that society isn't so complex. Nothing is very complex, or we'll ultimately figure out how it works. We're actually realizing that that's not the case, and the world is infinitely complex, and the more you learn, the less you know, the less certain you become. This is actually something that's going to be very important too, is we've lost the ability to value doubt. And that is so important, because without doubt, you have a lot of people that go around just assuming that they're correct with absolute certainty. You have a lot of absolutist people that whatever it is they believe is the ultimate truth, right? And um, there is no ultimate truth. Ultimately, you have to piece together pieces of information and come up with sort of a consensus of a very complex world. But we need to make sure that our systems are not so complex that they leave people out, and people who are less intelligent effectively can't navigate them. Um, an example of that would be the tax code. So what happens is you have a lot of intelligent people that get into, and well-meaning people generally, who get into politics or get into some institution and self-justifyingly create some type of regulation or program that becomes very highly complex. These are called technocrats. These people who, we take the experts. We're a society where we trust the experts, right? Whatever that means in any given subject field. And the experts make policies that are maybe like 10,000 pages. No, not even the smartest people are ever going to read the full policy or understand the full capacity of it. And we have tons of these stacked on top of each other. So something that should be relatively simple, like the tax code, we need to make sure that it's simple enough that people across the intelligence spectrum can effectively, fill out their taxes without having to hire a person to comprehend it for them. So I know that was a long-winded intro, but the things that I'm going to talk about tonight, two main things. The first is a book called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. He was the guy that wrote the book, The Bell Curve, which I talked about in the previous episode. The second thing I'm going to talk about tonight is Bullshit Jobs. That was another book written by David Graeber, and they're both extremely relevant. Another really important thing that you should know, I get into it in the previous episode, is IQ as a concept is extremely flawed in that it is a measurement of something, and it can measure that thing repeatedly, but we don't know what it measures. So this whole concept of you can reduce human intelligence to a single value, or you can reduce any complex system to a single value, it's kind of nonsense. And a lot of the IQ tests that are available in magazines and pop science are effectively BS. So at the beginning, I want to introduce you to two concepts that I just think are really interesting, and you'll find that they connect to some of the things that I talk about. One of them is called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. And effectively what the Gell-Mann amnesia effect is when you're reading a newspaper or watching a news program, and you can clearly see that what's being presented is false or was improperly presented, is riddled with error, whatever. And then you move on to the next thing, the next segment, the next article, and it's on a different topic, maybe on foreign relations or something you don't know much about. And all of a sudden you say, oh, wow, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. And you completely forget what you just knew, which is that this news source was entirely wrong, didn't know what they were talking about. So what is to say that they're right about this next thing? This news inherently has flaw in it, in that it's interpretation. And I think this is important for you to consider as things heat up in the 2020 election cycle, and as we're dealing with COVID, and as we're dealing with these riots that are occurring now, is news ultimately is selected pieces of information that is presented to you today in a 24/7 format. And if you think about the nature of what news is, it is an event that is unusual. That's what makes it news. And our brains have a morbid curiosity to them. It's what causes people to, when they drive by an accident, to look out the window to see if there's a decapitated head in the street or something like that. People have sort of like it kind of goes back to the days of the Colosseum. People like to, I don't know, they sort of have like in the back of their brain, animalistic desire to see like violence or the morbid. And that's ultimately what news taps into. And so it collects all of the things that are unusual and that are generally negative. And that was bad enough. But then came the 24/7 news cycle, which made a constant chemical drip of this. And the news stations figured this out back in the 90s with the OJ car chase on the highway that cut into the NBA finals, and they showed that, and they realized they discovered by accident, almost like when penicillin was discovered in the lab by accident. People are really into this. People like seeing car chases, they like seeing shootouts, whatever, violence. And so if we can compile that and give it to them 24/7, then we have a lot of viewership, we have a lot of eyeballs, and media plays to the advertisers, and the advertisers want eyeballs. So we are deceived in that what we see on the news we assume is the state of reality, but it's actually distorted reality because it's a 24/7 basically drug to your brain that keeps you coming back for more, and it makes you think, oh, this is reality. It's distorted reality because it's actually all the negative things brought to you. So remember what the Gelman amnesia effect is. Remember media inaccuracy, media bias. The simple act of selecting what to present to the public is bias. And journalists talk to public relations agents, and they are the ones that effectively work for the government, or they work for a corporation or something, and they determine what the news is. So keep all this in mind. Now, another thing that is really quite interesting is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what the Dunning-Kruger effect is how, to sum it up in a simple way, it's that ignorant people don't realize that they're ignorant. So I don't know if it's sort of like a linear effect all across the intelligence spectrum, but the less intelligent you are, the more intelligent you might think you are. So you might think that you're an expert in some subject because you just happen to have read an article about it or saw a program about it. So this is an extremely common effect where people kind of self-dub themselves as more intelligent than they actually are. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. Okay, the first thing is a book called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. And he tends to focus on intelligence. This guy is a libertarian, which means that he tends to value a lesser role for government. And he tends to be more fiscally conservative, like balancing the books, and socially liberal. That tends to be what libertarians are. When I say socially liberal, like, tends to be fine. People should be allowed to do what they want to do, liberty-wise, as long as it doesn't infringe on me or cause direct violence to me. So he's written a couple of great books. I've read about 4 of them. I've got another one now. But Coming Apart is really a great follow-up, I think, to the bell curve. And what it focuses on is white America from the 60s until about 2008. And the reason why he focuses on white America is because if he focused on America as a whole, then the different subcultures, the different races and ethnicities, they each have unique histories, and it would be hard to focus on everybody at once. So in the interest of limiting the variables, he focused solely on white Americans, which isn't still a homogenous group, but that was his goal. So he starts off saying that I'm basically considering this time frame from the Kennedy assassination to the recession in 2008. And what he notes is how there has been a cognitive stratification of society. And what that means is that there is a hard divide and a separation of cultures between people in the coastal enclaves, what you would call like the elites, and the people who are in the middle area. And he's not suggesting that. So he focuses on college admissions at the start of the book. And before I get into this, I should just say that it's obvious that there is an overlap with what he talks about and the electoral maps, red states and blue states on the coast. You have like high populations of people that generally vote Democrat, but they're all clustered in a couple major cities. And then you have the vast expanse of Republican, right? So there's going to be, whenever we talk intelligence, there's always a tendency of some group to claim supremacy for themselves. So I want to sort of head that off right now and say that there's no like Republicans or Democrats. Like, this is where the kind of term elite comes from. There's a lot of people say that, the people that went to Ivy League schools, they go to the big cities, they go to college, they have this sense of elitism or sense of supremacy. And there's something to that. You do see a lot of arrogance. And then the counter is like, oh, the people in the middle areas, they're all ignorant. So you have ignorance and arrogance. But the truth is, everybody has ignorance and arrogance. So there's an arrogance to the sort of blue collar people who live in the heartland as well, where they say, oh yeah, like those city slickers, they're book smart, but they're not street smart, and like the real honor is in a hard day's work and all that, and so they have their own form of arrogance. And then the liberal leaning people in the cities tend to have their own ignorance as well, where they don't, they have this sort of bigoted view of what a conservative is, or what a Republican is, or what rural people are like. Or maybe they have never even been to these places in the middle. It's kind of flyover area. So they go from one major city to another, they fly across. So liberals and conservatives in the red states and the blue states both have their intelligent people. It's just that intelligence between liberals and conservatives actually manifests itself differently. And Jordan Peterson talks about this. I recommend watching some of his YouTube videos. But liberals tend to be more creative and they generate new ideas. And conservatives tend to be more conscientious and industrious. And that means that they're better implementers. So both need each other for something to come about. If you only had liberals, then you would just have sort of this chaos of only new idea generation, and we're never going to actually implement any of it. We'll just keep coming up with new ideas, and no, let's not settle on anything. And then with conservatives, if you only had them, then it would just be like a burrowing in of just implementing something infinitely, even when it no longer works. It's just like, even when institutions are falling apart, it's like, oh no, we shouldn't change it. We should keep it the way that it is. So in a functioning society, in a functioning vehicle of state, you have the gas and the brakes, and the gas would be the liberals and the conservatives would be the brakes. And oftentimes you hear about conservative obstructionists or Republican obstruction, and how Democrats are the ones that come up with all the ideas, Republicans never do. And it's like that, yeah, that's kind of the point, is that one eases back and the other pushes forward. So you get this healthy tension between the two when things are working properly. So we need to remember that liberals and conservatives are both needed, and that ironically, so right now we're living at a time where you have a high density of it's almost like it's like tectonic plates in the creation of land masses from that sort of molten soup of things crashing together. That's sort of what's happening in Silicon Valley right now, where you have tons of ideas and new technology idea creation coming out of that, and that unsettles a lot of well, nearly everyone, because there's so much acceleration with technological development that it's destabilizing to society. Our institutions, our morals, everything else can't keep up to the pace of technology. But it's particularly, I think, upsetting to conservative people. And it's interesting because conservatism is only relative to what it's trying to conserve at any given moment. And right now, what it's trying to conserve is the Constitution and basically the vision that the founding fathers had in mind. And it's ironic because if you go way back, the founding fathers were the Silicon Valley of their day. They were the liberal intellectual elites who were coming up with this radical idea of having a country based on Enlightenment principles and liberty. And this was untried. And the conservatives at the time were saying, this is an insane idea. We'd prefer to just stay attached to Great Britain. And the conservatives of today are the ones that are defending that radical liberal idea of 270 years ago or whatever it is, So anyway, enough about that. But I just wanted to remind people that liberals and conservatives, both valuable and both have a range of intelligence within their domains. And remember, these are just labels too. So a lot of people don't fall squarely within whatever you consider a liberal or a conservative or a progressive or whatever. Okay, so Murray talks about how college admissions back during the 50s were sort of a crapshoot, where you get a lot of people who really maybe weren't unintelligent, but they were just sort of average intelligence, and they just happened to come from wealth. And you sort of get a cross section of society at a university, even at what are today elite universities. I think at the time too, but at Harvard, you just sort of get a cross section. It's not as intellectually, it wasn't then as intellectually rigorous as it is today. Relative to the other schools at the time, probably yes, but in an absolute sense, much more rigorous today than it was at the time. And so what Murray is saying is over the last, let's say, 6 decades, that college admissions have gotten much, much better at identifying the cognitive elite, the most intelligent people. So if you look at people who get college education as a whole, it's not saying that every single one of them is of elite intelligence, but it's saying that all of the people of elite intelligence have had some type of college education. So it's important not to confuse the two. But if you look at people who have had college education, and if you're listening to this right now, there's a good chance that you probably did, then the people that go to college are generally in the top 10 percentile of intelligence. And most of the people that you know and interact with in your life are probably also in the top 10 percentile of intelligence. And thinking about the least intelligent person that you generally interact with, they are probably also within the top 10 percentile of intelligence. So that kind of gives a sense of scale, because a lot of people are like, man, that person just not very smart. And they're actually closer to them than they think. And they've never met somebody or don't generally interact with somebody who's far at the extreme end of the other side of the intelligence spectrum. Now, the issue here, let me get my thought back. Okay, so people who are in the elite colleges, we're talking Ivy Leagues, they're more likely in the 1 percentile, so the top 1% of intelligence these days. And what that means is you have a lot of highly intelligent, culturally like-minded people clustered together, and they tend to be in 5, maybe 6 major cities in the United States. It's LA, San Francisco, Washington, New York, Boston, and let's say Chicago. And so you have tight clusterings of highly intelligent people, generally culturally liberal or progressive, and they don't interact with people outside of those cities or a clustering of zip codes surrounding those cities, very wealthy towns and suburbs, neighborhoods. So their entire life experience is lived within a few cities and traveling across the country to the other cities and the suburbs around them, and then maybe flying over to Europe and taking some, study abroad in Europe or whatever. And so they have similar values, and this starts to explain why so many people were caught off guard by the 2016 election, for example. And there is a troublesome elitism where I understand some of the ideas are, they seem self-evidently progress over prior ideas, and they are sometimes, and other times it's sort of like a matter of preference. But there's this disdain for people who live in rural areas, which oftentimes aren't even that far from cities. Like sometimes it's just literally a couple towns away is when you start to hit more conservative, more red areas. And what I see as troublesome is that people look at this area as the settlers back in the early days of the country saw the natives as these savage people that live on the frontier who have dated values and who refuse to be civilized, basically. So when you start to see people like that, and I know that there's also intense animosity in the other direction too, where it's like, you know, these city people, they're scum and they're trying to impose all their values on us and like we're going to double down. But it's like seeing people as not human or as savages or as just like intensely backwards. Yeah, there are people like that, but you have to realize that just as you know, ironically, a lot of liberals and progressives don't like generalizations that are made about groups that they kind of consider their pet groups, like, you know, black people, women, LGBT. It's also, you know, wrong to make, I don't want to say wrong, because generalizations are useful, but you have to realize the many exceptions. But it's reckless to be overly generalizing rural white people too. You know, it's like that's kind of the one group of people within progressive and liberal culture where it's okay to ridicule them. And I think that 2016 is very much a consequence of that. And we see ghosts from really, and I talk about this in the Daryl Davis episode. If you don't know who Daryl Davis is, I highly recommend listening to that episode. He is a black man who goes around and talks to different chapters of the Ku Klux Klan and has convinced a lot of them to leave the Klan and hang up their robes. But I was talking with Daryl in that episode about how there's a lot of ghosts from the Civil War, I think, that feed into the animosity and the sense of people who live in the rural South. They feel as if they are demeaned by the coastal people and they're looked down upon culturally, and they're seen as backwards and hillbillies and rednecks or whatever. And they're not entirely wrong, obviously. That is oftentimes how people view. But I think that the realization that you have these people who look down on you and you are seen as at the bottom of this hierarchy or this totem pole puts pressure on rural people to find somebody else to point at as below them. And I think that that's where you have an intensification of racism and common forms of ignorance and bigotry. It's sort of easy to fall on that. So like the disdain of coastal liberals for rural people, particularly conservatives, is then kind of passed down the line onto minorities, I think. So interestingly, a lot of the people who live in the South, and there's a guy, Thomas Sowell, who talks about this. He's an economist, and he talks about how the people who originally came to the United States, a lot of people tend to think that it's just like, oh, they were all just white people. White people are all the same. But they came from 4 distinct regions of the, I guess it was Great Britain at the time. And so you ended up with the Puritans, the Quakers, the something or others in the middle, and then the Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish came from the Highlands, and they're the ones that moved to the South, and they came from an intense culture of honor. And when I say culture of honor, it's like the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's like they carry feuds for generations, and if you insult somebody's mother, then you know that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, the Southern cracker culture that developed in the South is really what carried forward largely in impoverished Black culture that exists today in the inner cities as Black people migrated to northern cities for opportunity. So you see a sort of a cultural imprint of the Scots-Irish hills people, sort of the Appalachia lifestyle on modern Black poverty, which is interesting. Rural poverty and Black poverty. I should say rural poverty and inner city poverty, which is generally like white poverty and Black poverty, has a lot of similarities and definitely some major differences too. But okay, so with the intellectual elite going to colleges and universities on the coasts, you get this effect called the brain drain. And that happens across the planet, and it happens within the United States as well. Across the planet, basically people come from all different countries to the United States for opportunity. And when I say opportunity, it's basically if you have a dissenting opinion, you get refugees, you get people pursuing economic opportunity, but you also get a lot of people who they just are intellectuals that have a dissenting opinion, and they don't like the way that their country is run, and they challenge the administration, or they challenge some idea, and so they're eager to get to the United States so that they can openly have a dissenting opinion or pursue their idea or pursue their entrepreneurship or something like that. So you get this brain drain of a lot of the best and brightest from across the world coming to the United States. And then within the United States, you get a brain drain of people leaving rural areas to go to the cities and effectively staying there. So this has led to two very distinct cultures. And the thing that feeds the culture is people who go to university together tend to, like I was mentioning before, they tend to have similar ideas, similar values, and it's because it's a melting pot. Everybody's kind of coming together, so people tend to become more like liberalized in cities, more cosmopolitan. And they spend a lot of time together, and then they move into neighborhoods together, so they're around each other where they live, where they went to school. They get jobs where they tend to be working together, and they in the past, you would get married to somebody. I'm talking heterosexual marriage here. In the past, when women weren't going to college, then there was much more of a potential that the intelligence matchup between men and women was a mismatch, and you had more variability in the intelligence pairings of couples. Today, what you get is a lot of people who meet at college, so you have a highly intelligent man and woman who then get married and move to a suburb where they're like-minded with other people, and they raise their children, and they sort of cater and manage their children with a particular curriculum with other kids in maybe a private school. And a side note, because I also focus on anxiety a lot, I think that the over-managing of kids has caused an intense spike in anxiety, because really you find out your sense of identity and your limitations and what you are good at by kind of experimenting and failing. And if you have somebody who's always there to prevent you from failing and to push obstacles out of the way, then you're completely untested and you lack any sense of resilience. So when you go into the quote unquote real world, you basically fall apart, or you seek shelter in going back to school, going back to some type of institution that is a shelter and is a place where you don't have to actually test out real consequences or facing ideas that challenge you or people who you find disagreeable, all those things. So I think that a lot of the micromanaging of kids' schedules, like, hey, you have piano lessons, then you have baseball practice, then you have Boy Scouts, then you have whatever. Same thing for girls. I really think that has maximally impacted millennial and Z, I suppose, as well, anxiety levels. Okay, so looks like I got to plug. I'm going to charge the computer. To there's you. Okay, so you have people living in sort of closed communities, and I should mention that there are about 4 domains, primary domains to human happiness. And these are what the conservatives tend to hold central to what they believe is family, community, vocation, and faith. And I'll get more into the vocation later on in the episode too when I talk about bullshit jobs. But interestingly, liberals and conservatives tend to have a lot, they overlap on those categories. Both find those important. So there is a broad basis for commonality with liberals and conservatives, but liberals tend to want a broader interpretation of each of these categories. So they want all different types of families, whether it's gay marriage, whether it's single parent, whether it's blended families, divorce, whatever. There's broader concept of community and what's considered acceptable with community, broader concept of what's considered an acceptable job. So not just a, hey, suit and tie business job. People with tattoos, you can hire them and they're not like, complete monsters. And then with faith too, it's not just necessarily faith in the traditional Christian God. It could be faith in any God or no God or some set of principles, abstract principles like human rights. Not everybody has to have the same core faith in something larger than themselves. So really, the reason why I bring up these values is because they are falling apart in rural America, and they're doing very well in urban America. In the cities, you have people who they are spiritual or they go to church, and they live in nice neighborhoods with a sense of many different forms of community that tie them to their local town, their city. Their family is, like I said before, generally their day is structured, and they see their family, and they have flex time, and they're professional, and they are engaged with their job, and maybe they telecommute sometimes, and they have benefits packages that are more flexible to them. And so they are effectively able to engage in the full spectrum of human happiness. And what's happening in the rural areas is, as jobs become more cognitively loaded and as a lot of jobs are outsourced, you get people who are really without work. And this is particularly a problem for men who oftentimes are expected to be the breadwinner, but also see themselves in that role. That's how they get meaning, is through their vocation and what they can provide monetarily to a family, to the child. So you're getting manufacturing jobs shipped away, and it's gutting a lot of these rural communities, because that's what the whole identity of these places was based on. So they're leaving, and there's just this vacuum where you have people. Long-term unemployment leads to depression. It leads to substance abuse. Look at the opioid crisis. it leads to suicides, and oftentimes, to add insult to injury, women find these men less desirable because they can't be providers. So really their prospects for having a family are diminished, and communities fall apart, like I mentioned before. So you have vocation, family, community falling apart. And then on top of that, faith. There's a sense of sort of emptiness, and a lot of people, despite the stereotype of this is all kind of the Bible Belt and everybody's a Bible thumper, like a lot of people, they say they go to church, but they don't go to church as much as they say they do. So that's an important thing to know, is when you're conducting it, say you want to gather statistical data on something, and one of the things or do polling, one of the things you do is a survey. People lie. They try to make themselves look better than whatever they're actually doing. So if you look at what people say versus if you're somehow able to get data from another source, maybe like internet data that shows what their keystrokes are, or not their keystrokes, but what they're searching, what they're liking, what their actual behavior is, then it paints an entirely different story. So people in these areas have also lost faith or don't engage in church membership as much. So all four domains of happiness have crumbled. And there are things like racism, of course, that contribute to the rise of Donald Trump. All of these heavily, the sense of hopelessness, the sense of the world is passing you by and leaving you behind and not caring, all of those heavily contributed to the support of Donald Trump. The support of Donald Trump was basically a Hail Mary for a lot of people, where they said, everything's gone to shit, so why not just see what happens when we make this risky bet, And I think that there's a book called Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, and I recommend reading that. There's some overlap with this book Coming Apart, but he talks about his experience growing up in Appalachia, and he eventually went to Yale, and he talks about how he saw, based on his experiences growing up, how what has come about is basically inevitable, and he saw a lot of that. He talks about his experiences. He talks about how a lot of people, they get pride out of their ignorance. He talked about how a lot of other people are just they're in a terrible situation, and he talks about how ultimately everybody's still a human in these areas, in these hard-hit areas, economically hard-hit. And the culture of pride plays majorly into it, because it's like, we're not going to take any government handout or anything like that. So there's a disdain for welfare and such. And all of these things really connect to each other in interesting ways. The rise of racial and ethnic animosity. Everybody likes to have a scapegoat, or somebody they can point at as being less than them. So the big piece of the book that I haven't mentioned yet is the day-to-day lives of people in these different coastal or rural areas is quite different culturally. So something as small as what we eat and drink, something as seemingly small as what we watch on television. In urban areas, people don't watch as much TV. They might have one or two shows, maybe an HBO or Netflix show. In rural areas, there is a ton of television watching, maybe up to like 6 or 8 hours a day, a lot of daytime television. So, Judge Judy and Cops and Dr. Phil and a lot of the daytime talk shows. There's also, what do you drink when you go out? Rural tends to be Budweiser. If you live in the city, you probably drink something from a microbrewery, or you probably get a cocktail of some kind, or a hard seltzer, or a cider. uh, so lots more opportunities, obviously, urban, but you also have this kind of servant class of people in the cities that people are now getting used to, where you have Ubers and you have people delivering food. I see people on the bikes everywhere now. And then people used to brunch, and just these cultural things that people take for granted are just like entirely foreign, rural. And then there's, like I mentioned before, how you raise your kids. It tends to be more, hey, go out and do stuff rurally. And in cities, it's with people who are in the intellectual elite, it's a heavily managed schedule. So with all of this in mind, I think that a couple of the solutions that we ought to consider are encouraging people to move away from major cities. So encouraging opportunities and investment in other places, and putting headquarters, spreading out headquarters. Because right now you get these tight clusters around the political hub and the technological hub, so DC and Silicon Valley, as well as the financial hub, New York, Wall Street. And encouraging people to move out so that they're more spread out across the country, they're interacting with other people, because it's rather troubling that we take people who are highly intelligent and we isolate them early on, and we say, oh, we'll put you on the fast track, or we'll have you join Mets or whatever. We need everybody across the political spectrum engaging with each other and seeing each other as human still. And we also need to talk about having something like a universal basic income, I think, because it will allow a threshold of income that will allow people to spend as they wish and take care of themselves, sort of like keeping their head above the water as they get increasingly barred from economic involvement and economic utility. And as the gig economy opens up more, people will be able to choose tasks that adds on to that basic income, so that they can have more supplementing income to that. And then there are other ideas that I have too, but I won't really get into them right now. Time banking and portable benefits packages, so people aren't tied to their jobs. People would be able to explore other opportunities if they didn't feel anchored because their jobs are the only thing that offer the benefits. So I'm at a place right now where I think I can really get into the second part of the conversation, which is bullshit jobs. And once again, this book by David Graeber, it talks about how there is a massive section of the economy that you wouldn't really expect, because theoretically we live under capitalism, that is just entirely unnecessary. And if these jobs disappeared, then nobody would miss them, and it would have ultimately very little impact on the economy. So he has 5 categories. And at the very beginning of the book, he defines what a bullshit job is somebody who works a job that they know has little value, and they have to pretend to be busy often, and they ultimately have to keep up this pretense, this illusion that the job has value, when in reality they know that it doesn't. So like the long-term effect of that tension and of that sense of fraudulence is spiritually wounding and causes people to become basically intensely depressed. And so actually that's a little bit of what happened to me. I don't consider the job that I had to be bullshit in the sense that he describes it. I considered it to just be not in line with what I actually was or wanted to do. And yeah, I could really relate to the feelings that he described in this book. So he has 5 categories that he creates of bullshit jobs, and they're flunky, goon, duct taper, taskmaster, and box ticker. So a flunky is somebody that's just basically there to make a superior look good, because people in positions of power or influence like to have an army of minions, and the more that they have, the better they look. So you might have somebody who only occasionally gets um, assignments, and otherwise just spends most of their time having to look like they're busy. And then with goons, those are people who are used with they tend to use force. And you think about, or coercion, I should say, think about a telemarketer, somebody who is pushing something on somebody that that person doesn't ultimately need. And it's often a scam. So then the third one was a duct taper. And those are the people that are there because there's some system malfunction that doesn't actually, if somebody just put forward the effort to fix it outright, they wouldn't need duct tapers. But the example that he gives in the book, to simplify it, is like if you have a leak in the roof, instead of fixing the leak, if you hire somebody and pay them to put a bucket under the leak and then empty the bucket, or watch it and empty it every 20 minutes or something like that. So you get a lot of people like that in organizations, particularly coders who have to figure out how to get different pieces of code, different software programs to work together. And I'm thinking about my experiences, and there were often different, it would be like a merger between 2 companies, and then they use different systems, so you'd have to switch between the 2 systems, and there was never a, hey, we're going to bring all this documentation over into this new system. So instead of only having to learn 1 format, you have to learn 2 formats. Sometimes you have to learn 3 formats, and there's like stupid duplication and stuff like that. The 4th category, I said taskmaster before. I'm actually going to skip taskmaster, make that 5, and I'm going to talk about box tickers. So box tickers are people who serve the purpose of effectively collecting data to fill an objective of some kind, some type of program, like maybe a diversity initiative or something like that. So they collect data from the workplace and then they file it somewhere, and it's never thought of again. Maybe it's making people go to seminars because something was handed down, like you have to talk about sexual harassment, or you have to talk about this topic or that topic, or so I think you get a lot of this this bullshit probably in the HR department, but also with work-wide initiatives to get people excited about like charity giving, or get people participating in some new program that ultimately fizzles and falls apart. The example given in the book is somebody who works at a retirement community whose job it is to determine what the people want to do in their leisure time, what activity, and they collect all this data, and all the people are annoyed because they know the data is not going to ever be used for anything. Ultimately, the data just gets filed away somewhere, and the person has to tabulate it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then for some reason also keep a hard copy of it, and neither of which are used. So you get so much of that in the private sector and in the government. Man, there's a lot of bureaucracy. And then the last is taskmaster. And what a taskmaster does, he says there's 2 types. One of them is somebody who watches over other people, basically middle management, and they just make sure that they're doing their jobs. And oftentimes it's pretty clear that these people aren't needed, that people will just do their jobs without being overseen. So this person effectively has to spend their day looking busy, pretending like there's something to do. The other type of taskmaster is somebody who comes up with other bullshit jobs for other people to do, and they often get a title of some kind. They don't really have much actual power. They might have a couple people that are put under them in the their section of the hierarchy, but they're not, they actually don't wield any real power. They don't have any leverage over anyone. So all of these things together make up a pretty sizable chunk of the economy. And those are the main categories of bullshit jobs, but there's also a creeping bullshitization of jobs that actually have importance and value and meaning and contribute in some way. And so that creeping bullshitization would be like tons of emails, tons of meetings, tons of forced participation in seminars, a lot of kind of just think about a lot of the worst corporate aspects, you know, a lot of resentment that gets built up. Yeah, this is one of the things he talks about, is how we have a sort of perverted sense of, not perverted, we valorize work in a weird way, our culture, in that, yes, work is important when it's leading to some necessary end, but we insist that people work for the sake of work, and we often compare our misery. It's become a weird joke. And if you've seen the movie Office Space, or you see it a lot in The Office too, how people just regard work as almost like this purgatory, and the more hours, people say, how many hours did you work? Oh, I worked 45 hours. I worked 50 hours. I worked 80 hours, whatever. And it's seen as like this badge that people can wear of like how much work they've put in, regardless of whether that work is purposeful. Because there's a lot of make work, a lot of stuff that is just simply devised to make people look busy. And a lot of capitalist minded people, a lot of economists say that, oh, it's impossible that the American economy could have these jobs that you consider bullshit. Like, who are you to say that they're bullshit? If in a free market, how could there be bullshit jobs? They must actually have purpose, but the people that exist in those jobs just don't realize it. It has to be visible from the top. The manager must see that the job has purpose. No, there are actually a lot of jobs that don't have purpose. And one of the things that people need to realize is that we don't actually live in a capitalist system. Capitalism is just a bundle of concepts. It is an abstraction. And the same thing with communism. The world has never seen communism or capitalism. Every system that has existed has been some odd mix of things. When I say the world has never seen capitalism, we've never had purely open free markets, except maybe like at the dawn of the concept of markets. Like markets can exist in a small group of people. And then once you sort of hit a critical mass, probably Dunbar's number of about 150 people, where you stop recognizing the faces, and you have this cloak of anonymity where people can do things and get away with them, then you start to have to implement or put in place more regulations to maintain this market as the market becomes more complex. And once you have regulations, then the market is no longer free. So we in the United States don't live under capitalism. We live under corporatism. And by the way, what I was just talking about, communism only works on a small scale too. You can have a commune of people that work together and are effectively, producing equally. But once it gets to national levels, you have to put in a level of, or numerous levels of management. And once you have hierarchy, it's no longer people being equal. It's no longer a dictatorship of the proletariat. The concept is not communism anymore. So we live in a corporatist system with regulations, and it creates bureaucracy and duplication and unnecessary jobs. And that the insistence that we have this weird insistence of like, oh, did it create jobs? Okay, whatever regulation we're putting in place, whatever program we're starting, it has to create jobs. Both Democrats and Republicans are obsessed with employment and job creation, because right now that's linked to your pay. Like, people can't subsist anymore on really growing their own vegetables or hunting their own food. I mean, you can, it's possible, but people are highly tied into this modern system of food production and, you know, this modern economy. So it's really important that we realize what we think we live in is not actually what we live in. And we don't want to make the mistake of getting in a situation where we have tons of make work that is meaningless for people, and that does, like, I know this sounds dramatic, but intense spiritual harm to people, because we say that work ought to be your sense of meaning. In our culture, work is central to people's sense of identity, particularly as people have drifted away from monotheistic religion, and they no longer share the common identity of having a religious core. There's work. And so what the Soviet Union was an experiment with trying to achieve full employment, 100% employment. And when you have that, you create massive inefficiency and people doing things that don't need, like, you think about unions at their worst, and you have 30 people on a road crew with only 3 of them doing anything while the rest are lounging around. That's the kind of stuff that was going on in the Soviet Union, just to make sure that everybody was working and had a job. And even if you went to the bakery and wanted a loaf of bread, you'd have to go through like 6 people or something like that. It was crazy inefficiency. And a lot of that exists in our country, not to that extent, but we're going to reach an interesting place where, to solve our other issues like climate change, we're going to have to make our economy more efficient. And to do that, that's going to have to mean leaning on the lever of technology and automating a lot of jobs and introducing more efficiency where it's possible. And it's possible in a lot of places, because the idea of creating jobs goes against the idea of efficiency. They're at cross purposes to each other. And I think it's really the first time in history that we can automate jobs, and we have such wealth that we can automate a lot of these jobs and take some of the cost savings of that and reallocate some other money and provide a universal basic income where you don't have to force people to go to jobs that don't need to exist. And yeah, it's a very surreal situation that we find ourselves in right now. So if you actually think about what a job is, it's nothing more than a bundle of tasks. And what we're going to have to do as a culture is unbundle all these tasks from each other. So I think that the emerging economy is going to essentially consist of this, we could call it the Great Unbundling. It's going to be tons of tasks that are available to people, and people can pick and choose tasks as necessary and build a career out of that. That's going to be called the gig economy. It's something that I launched into about a year ago, and that's going to be how people, I believe, engage in work moving forward. It's going to shift much more heavily into that. So contract working, gig working, freelance, whatever you want to call it, it's the gig economy. And income is going to be more variable, and people are going to live down to the standards of effectively when, let's say your income fluctuates month to month, week to week. You're going to live down to generally when your income is lowest, because you can't rely on consistent income. Sometimes it might be fantastic, other times it's not that great, but the average works out over time. Now, I think that our generation is going to, I think millennials and Zs, our assets are going to be in the digital space much more than in the material world. The boomer generation and maybe partly into the X generation, they spent their careers kind of running on the treadmill, trying to accumulate more consumerism. Basically, in the physical world, a house, a vacation house, a couple cars, maybe a boat, things were status symbols, and we're leaning much more towards an access economy of experiential living and opportunities to hang out with friends, maybe go on vacations when we want to go on them, rather than this traditional career ladder and buying things, consumerism, and then having this big chunk of time at the end where we do all the stuff that we wish that we had done over the course of our life, called retirement. So we're not going to have a traditional retirement. I think our assets are going to be in the digital space, and consumerism is going to move into the digital realm. So we're going to be vast digital consumers, and it's going to be important that we remember that we're making the decisions that we're making largely because of the opportunities that are available to us in the technology. So like, we're not better than the generations that came before us. We're just sort of like the natural next stage of generational evolution. And so, you know, all this okay boomer stuff, and hey, you ruin the planet and stuff like that. Like, we are inheriting a lot of debt. We're inheriting a lot of economic debt and environmental debt, but we would have done the same things in the situation, because you know, this isn't like a total pardon, but there was a lack of understanding of exactly what was going on. There was a lack of information. The internet has made so much more information available, and we've grown up with the internet, and we know how to sort of check and disprove things and see what's actually bullshit. And I think that we shit on consumerism, and I do think consumerism is it promotes growth, but it's a bad model to try to base your personal identity on and sense of meaning. But I think that we're going to be intense consumers too. We're just going to be in the digital space. And, you know, I know it's easy to look at the boomers and say, hey, look at how much oil you consume. Look at all the reckless pollution and whatnot. We're going to be consuming an intense amount of energy too. We're just not going to see it as what we now see as like evil energy, which is you know, exhaust coming out of tailpipes. We're going to have to build massive server farms and massive technological infrastructure that is going to be consuming an immense amount of energy. Immense. So yeah, we're going to be using quite a bit of energy. And think about I just this past week and the week before that was helping to clean out a house, and I saw the accumulation of physical stuff and objects over a 90-year lifespan. And we're going to just have digital clutter. I mean, think about all the photos you take, the email accounts that you have, all the data that you produce in the digital sphere, and how it's just, you're like a digital hoarder. You just let it collect. We're just a different, we're a modified organism. You know, we're like the first cyborg generation with our smartphones. So I think that the Great Unbundling and the gig economy and the concept of universal basic income, and on top of that, like I mentioned before, the concept called time banking, which is basically you can use your time. Imagine an app where people can upload tasks that they need done. These aren't paid tasks, but they're, hey, like I need help. The lady down the street needs help putting a propane tank in. So this would allow people who previously had jobs to re-engage with their communities. They would be able to, in the worst case scenario, it would become like the social credit system in China. But if we had some gamification of community building, where we had tasks and sort of digital rewards and things like that, then we could really bring back civic society, I should say, and make a more robust sense of community across the country, rather than people just sitting resentfully at home watching TV, waiting for their next income check to come and then buying booze with it. So all of those things, and then the portable benefits as well. Think about how many people would just be unleashed from their shitty jobs that they're stuck in. And think about how many people in their jobs cannot say what is truly on their mind. Not saying people should just vent unconstructive things, but think about how much scandal and corruption people don't bring up because they want to keep their jobs and they want to just lay low. You know, they want to maintain their reputation. They don't want to draw attention to themselves because they need that check to buy food, to support their family, whatever. Think about if all of those things come together, the economy that we would unleash would be like a renaissance. It would be like a creative renaissance in this culture where people could do the things that they enjoyed. You know, they would be within their means, and they could create art and music and podcasts and content of all sorts. And this whole concept that we have to keep people chained to a job that doesn't do anything and keep them immiserated, we don't have to do that anymore. We have the means to not do that and the wealth. And this is in its infancy, but I never like to present an issue without presenting some potential solutions too. So start thinking about these things, start researching them more, because all of these ideas are out there, but they need to be brought together, and they need to be talked about. They need to become more commonplace, and people need to start to think, hey, this could actually become a reality. So that's pretty much all I have for tonight. There's plenty more of other conversations that I could have had off of this. And the next episode that I'm going to have is going to be about race. And after that, there's going to be an episode about chemicals, particularly the petrochemical lobby. And I'm going to have some stories of different interesting phases of the chemical industry. And chemicals you might have heard of, like Corexit and Agent Orange, and a lot of Roundup, things like that. So that's all I have for tonight, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. And I'm going to start to remind you at the end of these episodes now, check out the content on YouTube and leave comments and subscribe if you are down to do that on the website, manvmobpodcast.com. And also, please, if you have the chance, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Stitcher, wherever. So, good night, everybody.